Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to part 3 of Prospero Burns. And we're gonna have to start out with a bit of a rant here, are we not? So, the Space Wolves are still trying to break into Eben's memories. Presumably both to get a better look at them, to truly understand what's going on, and maybe to get some real evidence against Magnus, against the Thousand Sons, and against Amun. Again, why they did not raise this question at Nicaea, why Amun was not arrested, and so on, is just... I don't bloody know. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And even if they did not have a surefire case, which honestly, from their perspective, they do. They saw Amun of the Ninth Fellowship bind a Custodes, talk to Eben, and admit his duplicity. As far as the Custodes and the Space Wolves involved would be concerned, they have Amun and the Thousand Sons dead to right. And yet, they choose not to pursue it for some mystifistical fucking reason. So I can only assume that they are trying to find yet more solid evidence within the mind of Ibn Rustam. This has frustrated them, however, as whatever the Thousand Sons did to Eben, they have done so very thoroughly, and they have not been able to break in. So they try something a little bit more nuanced. Whilst Hellwinter is attacking Eben's mental defenses from the front, another Space Wolf Psyker, by the name of Ida, attempts to sneak around the rear, so to say, and enter Eben's mind more surreptitiously in a stealthy fashion, which he succeeds in, but he also succeeds beyond his wildest imaginations. For not only does he gain access to Eben's mind, he stumbles into the mind of the thing that has reshaped Eben's mind. And it's no Thousand Son. It is a creature far beyond even Magnus's progeny. And upon discovering Ida's presence, it attacks him, it infests him, and it turns him into a monstrous wolf. Now, whether or not this is it actually flesh-crafting Ida, or merely unlocking the curse of the Canis Helix deep within him, up for interpretation, but the result is the same. Ida has been, in the eyes of the Space Wolves, irreversibly tainted, and he also tries to attack Eben, presumably in an attempt on the demon's behalf to tie up some loose threads, I guess? Since right now Eben is no longer a strength for the demon, he is most decidedly a weakness, a way for the Space Wolves to attack him. But here's where it gets really odd. The Space Wolves know what a demon is. They claim to know a great deal about Maleficarum, yet even after this reveal, they do not seem to fully understand the scope of what they are dealing with. In fact, they seem to continue to lay the blame for all of this at the feet of the Thousand Sons, without really explaining why they are doing this. But it would appear that the answer as to why is unfortunately the very same answer as to why the Thousand Sons fell. Arrogance. The Space Wolves, Leman Russ included, are now so completely and utterly convinced of the justness of their own cause, and that they have the one and only true answer, that any information that arrives that seems to counteract that narrative, that seems to be in opposition to it, is simply just dismissed, or interpreted as further corroboration of their established idea. Leman Russ is completely convinced that it is the Thousand Sons and Magnus that has placed Eben amongst them. He summons Eben in an attempt to talk to Magnus. Because Russ doesn't want to do this, that much is clear. He is offering Magnus a way out, communicating with Magnus through the way that he assumes Magnus can hear. And he does not try to communicate with Magnus after that, through more well, traditional means of communication. That alone shows an astounding level of arrogance. Russ believes that he has seen through Magnus's plans to such a degree that there is not even the faintest hint of doubt, not the slightest inclination that he may be incorrect in assuming that Eben is the one and only conduit, a hotline directly to Magnus. And as for Magnus's warning that Horus is going to betray the Emperor, Russ knows of it, and he also knows of what happened with Ida. And after Ida was subdued and captured, he also gave the same warning, that Horus would turn against the Emperor. Ida claims that he saw inside of the demon's mind, he saw the anathema, and he saw what it would do to Horus. So Russ now has two different sources claiming that Horus is going to fall. But instead of, at the very least, humoring this, Russ simply dismisses it out of hand as yet another ruse on Magnus's behalf. Russ has made up his mind now so completely and utterly that, as mentioned, any additional information that comes to light will either be dismissed as a ruse on Magnus's behalf, or even be twisted into further justification. Russ states that not only did Ida's statement not make him question his course of action, it reaffirmed it, because this shows in his mind that Magnus is so desperate to affect the ways of the Imperium, to manipulate the Imperium and the Wolves, that they would go through the trouble to send two warnings in two different areas to enforce the message and make it seem more credible. And additionally, here's the interesting thing. Russ is completely convinced that there's no way Horus can fall. This is one of the cornerstones of his beliefs, one of the reasons why he is so willing to just dismiss everything else out of hand. But he is also so utterly convinced that Magnus both can and will fall, that he sees anything that suggests Magnus is innocent as just yet further confirmation of Magnus's duplicity. Leman Russ and the Space Wolves, for all of their cleverness, for all of their subterfuge, have fallen prey to their own created image of themselves. Perhaps it is an aspect of an inferiority complex. Perhaps they are genuinely bothered by the fact that the other legions view them as barbarians, and so they have to be the clever ones. They have to be the ones that are oh so smart and oh so sneaky. But at the end of the day, this is arrogance. And that self-belief directly leads them to read so much into the situation that they don't accept the warning right in front of them. The Thousand Sons thought they could know everything, and so always sought more knowledge, and that was to their detriment. The Space Wolves thought they already knew everything that was to be known, and so did not seek further knowledge when they needed to. I guess it is inevitable that they were to clash then, isn't it? And also, I often complain about how stupid some of the Imperial characters appear to be throughout the course of the Horus Heresy, particularly in a certain author's books, and we've definitely had some examples of that as well in this book. The Custodes once again demonstrate beyond any question that they are bad at their bloody jobs. Very, very, very bad at their bloody jobs. But these actions on behalf of Space Wolves and the Leman Russ, I can buy this. This isn't stupid. This is rooted in the Space Wolves' behavior. It is internally consistent. They are arrogant. They are too sure of themselves. They are belligerent. And their animosity against the Thousand Sons creates the perfect framing for all of this. They are primed to take the least charitable interpretation of any event that relates to the Thousand Sons, both through their previous history, their previous clashes, and of course the events on Nicaea. Now, granted, that is a little bit of a shard of glass in the pudding, shall we say, because that event, if anything, should have made the Space Wolves question, this is awfully strange. Amun, who we should have had under observation, gets all weird when we carve a mark of aversion onto him. That's odd. And we chose not to arrest him and interrogate him. That's odd. We could have really had a deep dive into this, but we just skip over it. And then, of course, Ida stumbles into the memories of something that clearly is not just another psyker. And again, this does not ring any warning bells. That I do consider strange. A lot of this is entirely consistent with how the Space Wolves would probably act in regards to the Thousand Suns. But there are a bit too many flashing red lights here. And again, the Space Wolves have now arrived at the point where they will try to make anything fit into their pre-existing narrative. Because they are so desperate for that to be correct, because the consequences, should they be wrong, is terrible. That would mean that they're being sent to war against a fellow legion on false premises. That would be terrible. That would be something that they would not even want to countenance. That is the ultimate nightmare of the Emperor's executioners, isn't it? To be used for their intended purpose, but against an innocent target. There's an old saying. Alright, I'm going to probably butcher it a bit here, because I only remember it roughly, but it is incredibly difficult to explain a thing to somebody whose salary depends on them not understanding it. To put it in a slightly different way, when you are morally invested in something, when you are utterly convinced that this thing is correct, and you have based part of your beliefs, your identity, your ideology, your very existence, etc., upon that assumption, then it is very difficult to convince anyone that that assumption is incorrect, because it would literally turn their entire life upside down. This is one of the reasons why Conrad Kurz developed a split personality disorder, because he was so utterly convinced that all of the horrible things he was doing was for the good of the Imperium, to avoid the horrible future. And when it started to become clear that instead it was causing that very horrible future, his mind simply escaped from it. It tried to separate itself from that idea. It tried to deny it to the point of creating an alternative personality that could embrace it. Something to blame it on. After all, this wasn't me. This was the Night Haunter. This wasn't actually me, Conrad Kurz. I didn't do this. I was just trying to help. And there is an aspect of this in the Space Wolves. But again, the warnings just seem a little bit too goddamn obvious here. It may be very difficult to explain, but these are some awfully bright flashing lights. Anywho, I think I've gone over this enough, so let's move on in the story. When the Space Wolves arrive at Prospero, it is undefended. Because Magnus, realizing his mistake, realizing that everything he had built his entire life upon, his very fundament, his moral investment, all of that was wrong. And it crushes him, it breaks him, and he throws his defenses open. Which again is a bit of a derp from him because, well, okay, Magnus, I get it, you're hurting right now, you're panicking, you're trying to literally rebuild your entire life, and you know you have failed, you know you have done great harm. But once again, if either Russ or Magnus had had the IQ required to pick up a fucking phone, then all of this could have been resolved. Magnus would have gone like, yeah, I know, I fucked up. Yeah, come fetch me. I'll surrender, I'm not gonna fight you or anything. And Russ could go, thank you, brother. That was what I was trying to get you to do by talking to your puppet here. And Magnus would be like, what? And then they could argue with one another. No, I didn't fuck with this random mortal's head. I mean, come on. If I was going to spy on you, I'd just like make a magic space bird or something. You can make those. And Russell will just be like, yeah, okay, maybe we read a hint much into this rando dude we found in the freezer. But hey, it's all good now. Lucky we both know how a phone works, hey? But no, despite Prospero's defenses all being down, the Space Wolves, yet again, read way too much into it and go like, well, he's utterly undefended, but he could have secret defenses. Yes, best bombard them from orbit just to make sure. And that too, I can definitely justify from the Space Wolves' perspective. You know, they're afraid of Malvacarm, I get it, but we also need to remember that it takes weeks, if not months, for a fleet to coast into system to get close enough to the planet to actually do this. The Space Wolves would have had, I mean, at the absolute very least, if we assume the Space Wolves are, hyper effective, their fleet all arrives as planned, they form up super quickly, and they head off at maximum burn. Even then, they will have days upon days to just bloody send a Voxhail. But no, and that is retardation. That is not in-universe reasoning. That is not, in behavior pattern of the Space Wolves or the Thousand Suns. That is just dumb. That is just dumb. And speaking of dumb, so the next part here, I think this is very much so a I've read this too many times thing, rather than necessarily an overly objective critique, but the writer now basically shows us the assault upon Prospero from the point of view of Eben and how he tells the story as a skald. And I'm sure the first time I read this, I was like, yeah, this is pretty cool. But now I am just like, wow, this is description pornography. It takes 40 minutes in the audiobook to basically go from them attacking Prospero to them landing on the bloody surface. It's like, I genuinely expect Eben to just halt the story at some... Which he does, by the way. At one point, he uses the wrong word, and one Space Wolf is like, teacher, I don't understand the word you're just using. Because Space Wolves don't understand Low Gothic, apparently, for some mystifistical fucking reason. And we literally have to stop this really, really long, overly descriptive story for a Space Wolf to ask what the word hawk means. Ay. But I genuinely expect him to just start breaking into a long-winded description. He literally describes his clothing, okay? I'm just like, oh yes, and the internal panels of the storm bird, they had weird glyphs on it. It looked kind of like a big-penised wolf raping a little sorcerer or something. Oh yes, the lines had been cut with great wrath and vigor. It's a bit much. Just a hint much, in my opinion. Oh, and speaking of a bit much, we're back to the names again. So, the demon thing, now having taken the form of Horus, and being able to enter onto Prospero and retain that form, which is interesting. Granted, this is the plant of sorcerers, but for a demon to be able to manifest so easily and so completely is outside of the usual. He tries to control Eben with his name, but once again, Eben apparently has many names now, including his true name, which nobody knows, which yet further fucking questions. But even the name he does have has some pull over him. So if that's the case, then surely being able to use the name Bjorn instead of Bear, or Bear instead of Bjorn, would also have some effect. God damn it. This name magic thing makes me want to cry. It really, really does. Oh, and also, if this demon can just casually manifest itself on Prospero, something that requires a great deal of warp energy, mind, and its real goal originally was to have the Thousand Suns and the Space Wolves destroy one another, why doesn't it just bring more of its friends? I mean, there's plenty of bloodshed going on. A pretty major demon can just manifest, just poof, out of Eben's memories. So, surely, clearly, there is a pretty large, pretty stable conduit going on here. And if, again, the stated goal is to kill both legions, Well, this seems like a pretty damn good opportunity to do just that, as they are both weakened and engaged with one another. But, alas, I guess the demon didn't plan quite that far ahead. It is eventually murdered by the combined forces of the Silent Sisterhood and the Space Wolves, but just too late to, send off another telephone call to Russ going, "Hey, so we found a demon who claims he arranged all of this shit?" Sigh. Oh, and once again, the Thousand Sons eventually turn traitor, or, well, semi-traitor at the very least. Both the Thousand Sons and the Alpha Legion has a bit of a problem in that in 30k, it is heavily hinted at and basically outright stated that many of them are still to an extent loyal, or at the very least not working towards the same goals as Horus, and instead attempting to preserve some element of the Imperium or humanity. Whilst in 40k, all of that appears to have been completely forgotten. That's a bit of the problem when you start writing backstory like this. You run into quite a lot of conflicts with modern 40k. Oh, and speaking of conflict, so Horus, at some point between Leman Russ being dispatched to Prospero by the Emperor and him arriving at Prospero, Horus sent him an order to not capture Magnus, but instead kill Magnus and destroy his legion. Now, Russ partially disobeyed this order, or maybe he didn't receive this order before he talked to Eben. It's a bit unclear because the order is not actually mentioned in Prospero Burns at all. Which is, of course, yet another little bit of a warning light. Oh, yeah, Horus, the guy who several sources now is warning you is going to turn traitor? Yeah, he's asking you to ignore the Emperor's orders and instead kill Magnus. It is getting more and more difficult to rationalize the actions of Leman Russ at this point. I mean, we have been told throughout the book that they really, value Horus, they look up to him, they kind of admire him as, the Emperor's chosen proxy in the galaxy, so again, there is a degree of justification for why they would just take his word for it, but god damn! A lot of objections are starting to pile up around Leman Russ at this point. And during the fight between Eben, the Space Wolves, the Null Maidens, and so on against the demon, it is yet once again confirmed that it was the demon who was behind this, and Leman Russ has no reason to distrust the Skald too, surely, or is he as well touched by Maleficarum? I guess he technically is, so there you go, I suppose, but even though, at this point, I agree, probably far too much blood had been spilled between the Thousand Sons and the Space Wolves to ever, get back on the same side again, you would at the very least think that the Emperor would make diplomatic overtures at this point to make some attempt at figuring out where Magnus went and initiating communications with him, because, again, we now seem to have some pretty damn clear indications that he wasn't at fault directly. Oh, he's not blameless. Oh, absolutely not. Magnus caused this as much as Leman Russ did. But even so, with all of this evidence that Magnus was at least partially blameless, I mean, I guess you could argue that the Emperor is busy, certainly, that the Imperium is busy, okay, maybe, but and Magnus did go into the Eye of Terror, essentially, so, there's a point as well. Why he did that is still unclear too, but this book, for all of the strengths in it, like the mystery, that was really cool. The fact that at the end we kind of go like, okay, I didn't remember Bear's name to be Bjorn, because apparently I have troubles with the names of animals, which he has, spoken of some several times during the course of the book. That's a really cool touch. That is a really cool logical touch to the mystery. The whole names thing still doesn't make a lick of sense, but hey, details. But it leaves so many unanswered questions, so many oddities, so many... I mean, think about this from the demon's perspective, okay? His plan relies on so incredibly many coincidences, so many 1,000,000,000 happenstances. It relies on Russ ignoring the warning of Ida. It relies on Russ ignoring the warning that he was relayed from the Emperor. It relies on Russ accepting Horus's orders over the Emperor. And it relies on Russ not picking up a bloody phone and calling Magnus directly instead of trying to speak to what he presumes to be his conduit. And the biggest part of it all is it relies upon the Space Wolves and the Custodies not arresting Amun, which is just... it hurts my brain to even think about. There seems to be absolutely no reason or rationale or thought behind it. It seems like one of those plot points that the author simply just forgot about, basically. The mystery in this book is, by and large, pretty damn solid. It is pretty damn well executed, but it does in the end fall prey to that most common of problems with large, massive, wide-spanning mysteries like this, in that, in the end, it relies on a dozen ridiculous coincidental happenstances to finally actually occur. But oh well. All in all, Prospero Burns is still a pretty good book. It falls prey to some of the problems with the mystery, absolutely. The author is a bit prone to descriptive pornography, and the book's maybe, 10 to 20% longer than it needed to be because of it, but that's not the worst thing ever, to be sure. And I do really like the way in which it portrays the Space Wolves and Leman Russ, despite some questionable decision-making near the end there, which borders on outright retarded. And that is starting to become a little bit of a problem with the series overall. It seems as if Chaos is getting away with a lot of shit, not because their plans are necessarily that good, but because the opposition is that dumb. The Thousand Suns book is actually a good example on how to do that correct, because Magnus wasn't being stupid, he was just being cocky, self-confident, overconfident. He wasn't being a retard, he just vastly overestimated his power, and that overestimation too was a part of a greater plan on behalf of the Chaos Powers. Whilst in this case, Russ not picking up a phone, or ignoring anything and everything that seems to suggest that maybe Magnus's warning was legit, that's less in character and more, well, dumb. And speaking of dumb, the next proper book, The Outcast Dead, Now, there are some good parts of that book as well, I'm not saying there aren't, but it is one of those books that I don't really necessarily think had to be written at all, but I will cover it. In fact, I might even go after the little short story collections after all. I'm yet to decide entirely on that, but maybe. I did read the little collection recently on the trip to Germany again, and there are some interesting things there, so maybe. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.